Thank
you very much, Mr Chair. I want to respond to the comments made by the Minister and the Chair, and I do appreciate him taking a call on this Part 3 of the legislation. I think we found out what he did in his lunch break. He went and logged on to Wikipedia and did a search for archives around the world, but he didn't actually address any of the questions that we've been raising about the National Archives here in New Zealand, because regardless of how they operate other places in the world, with very different political systems and very different public service setups and very different cultures, he still needs to discuss the concerns we've been raising about the archives in New Zealand. But it did remind me of a comment that the Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Bill English made earlier this year, when he said that he thought that we could get rid of a whole lot of government departments because they didn't need policy advice, they could just Google it. Government by Google. And I wonder whether this is an extension of that, government by Google and Wikipedia, from Minister for Archives, who is overseeing. We could let Google do the archiving. It would perhaps be helpful, but this is a very, very telling legislation, because in part two, the Minister was forced by standing orders to table a document that he'd been quoting from, and then members of the opposition noticed a bottle of Twink appearing after the document had been tabled, and we were concerned, and we raised concerns about that, and my colleague Steve Chadwick very helpfully suggested that perhaps if the Honourable Nathan Guy was going to write his autobiography, he could call it, in light of Richard Prebble's I've Been Thinking, perhaps he could call it I've Been Twinking. So just a little helpful suggestion from the opposition on a Saturday afternoon to the Minister. But I want to talk about the impact of this part on the Chief Archivist, because when you go through the departmental... Oh, toes awake. Welcome back, Mr Henardi, always a pleasure. Now, what we notice when we go through the departmental report is that the officials are at pains to constantly point out that the Chief Archivist is subordinate to the Chief Executive, subordinate. This is not just about the archives simply moving to a new place and they'll still be able to operate the way they always have, because it really stands out in the bill and in the departmental report the extent the government has gone to point out that the Chief Archivist is subordinate. And that is going to come with... It is ridiculous to suggest that when you have the Chief Archivist now relegated to the third tier level of management in the Department of Internal Affairs, that they are going to be able to operate the same way they already have. Because what's going to happen is that they are now going to be subject to budgetary pressures. The Chief Executive of Department of Internal Affairs gets his budget. Now, he's got a lot of different parts in Internal Affairs that have to be covered, including very worthy areas like New Zealand Fire Service and passports and births, deaths and marriages and all these areas. And the Minister and the Chair has given us absolutely no guarantee that money that's currently dedicated for the National Archive... Well, Tau Henare says he doesn't care, and we know the National Party don't care about the preservation of documents for the future, because they constantly try and rewrite history every day in this House, constantly, and I believe it would probably help them if the documents that prove they're wrong are no longer in the public arena. So I understand why Mr Henardi is pleased to see the National Archives destroyed, pleased to see them destroyed, because he is one who has had a very colourful political history, jumping from political party to political party. He'd probably quite like it if all those documents disappeared. He'd probably also like it if all the documents showing that he was the worst union organiser in the history of the universe also disappeared from the public arena. But this new Chief Archivist will be subordinate to the Chief Executive. They will very, very definitely face budgetary pressures and cuts now that they're in a department where they're having to share resources, and that will be damaging for the National Archives. The other point is, of course, now archives will no longer be presenting an annual report to Parliament. So they are not going to be the same... Well, Mr Henardi has never liked having to do any work at select committees, so he's probably hoping this means a little bit less work for the government. But the fact is that the financial review process is a very important one. It's been one of the ways we've been able to follow the progress of archives and the National Library, which we discussed in Part 2. And what did we learn from that financial review process? These are incredibly well-run organisations. These are efficient. They get top marks across the board. There is no mischief here which needs to be solved in Part 3 by destroying the National Archives. Which begs the question again, why are we here in urgency on a Saturday passing a piece of legislation which fixes nothing?
Good. Darian Fenton.
Appreciate very much the opportunity to take my first call on the State Sector Management Bill on Saturday afternoon at 2:30, and we will be on this bill for some time. I think we may be on this bill. There is a lot to talk about too, and I'm sure Mr. Henare will make his contribution. He'll get on his feet and make a 5-minute contribution because he obviously feels so passionately about this. Although I suspect actually the opposition will continue to sit in silence. Mr. Chair, addressing Part 3, I've been listening to the debate on this bill and becoming increasingly concerned about what's happening to the independence of our National Library and our archives, because they really are important. In many ways they define us as a people. They protect our democracy, our history, and of course the accountability of government. Very, very important matter that. And I think what we're seeing is this government preparedness to be accountable is being washed away by every session that we have in urgency. No one's allowed to come along and say what they think. They don't want to hear from people about it. They don't want to go through the processes. And actually, I'm really worried about that because I don't want to ever see a situation exist where those in power write our history or influence them. Because we've seen that happen in history. We don't want to have that happening in New Zealand, but this could be a key step towards that, and I'm very worried about that. Look, our archives and our National Library are part of our collective memory as a nation. And I was having a look at what's in the archives, and, just for the purposes of the listeners, I think it's worth going through. What we're talking about here, we're not talking about a few dusty old books locked away in a couple of rooms. We're talking about over 96 kilometres of archives, 21,500 motion picture reels, over 5 million records, which is described on Archway, which is the main online website, Finding 8. It also holds our founding document, the Treaty of Waitangi. It holds our founding document. That's right, it was damaged when it was last under the auspices of the Department of Internal Affairs. It also holds the Declaration of Independence of the Northern Chiefs. Now, I would have thought that the Māori Party would be really concerned about the possible damage that can be done to that and the interference that could go on if, for example, the government wanted to pretend that we never had that. It could just disappear. It could just twink it out. Yes, they could twink it out. That's right. The Minister for Twinking could just twink out. That's right. It holds the women's suffrage petition from 1893. That's really, really important. But of course, that could be twinked out as well, couldn't it? We could pretend that we could just go back to saying, well, we don't want women to have the vote. Actually, I noticed one of the really interesting collections that's on display at the moment at the archives, and it's called Walter's World. Now, Mr Nash, that wonderful Labour Party member, would be interested in this because this is about his great-grandfather. It's called Walter's World, the Nash Collection. And it says about the exhibition, from food to fascism, from world travel to world wars, Walter Nash kept everything. His papers provide an insight into all aspects of the world in which he lived. The extent of the collection is vast, several thousand bundles of paper, photos and other items, and they are currently being listed for placement on Archway. It's based on loose themes. It's the Nash collection. It's about one of the great Labour Prime Ministers in New Zealand, important part of our history, really important part of our history, on display at the National Archives, along with many, many other really important collections. As I said, that are part of our collective memory as a nation. Now, recently a Booker Prize winner said of politicians, "Tell me what you read and I will understand what you know." I would love to know what the Minister reads. Actually, I'd love to know. He's clearly taken notice of the very good advice he's had from the National Archives and the lessons of the 1990s merger. Very lot of history there. Taken no notice, which of course Labor had to fix up. He had to twink out a document that was tabled in the House today because he hadn't read it properly. So I have to, so I think we understand what he knows because we know what he hasn't read. I'm friends, Mr Chair, with a number of senior people in this field, and they're really alarmed at this bill. They're very alarmed at the potential of this bill to undermine their independence, their passion, and not